Snubbers. Captain Adam Knutson from Hiatus Charters here. Got some great captains with me to talk about today's topic. Make sure, before we get started, hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell. That'll get you a reminder every time I post a new video. Glad you're here today. Got to give a shout out to our sponsors. Busch Light, always a great sponsor of ours, and Captain Chuck's too here in Ludington. Well, let's bring in the captains and get the show on the road.
My name's Win Wolf, and I'm my main port that I fish out of is St. Joseph. I have a charter boat out of there. I also fish up and down the coastline in all the tournaments. I fish pretty much every tournament on the lake, and then I spend August usually up in Manistee.
Hi, my name is Kevin Hughes, and I fish out of the port of Onekama. Been a captain out of there for 40 years. I've been fishing there for like 55 years. It's a great place to fish. My boat's called the Sandpiper 3. I had the Sandpiper 1, Sandpiper 2, and now I'm on the Sandpiper 3. And because I'm retired now, I charter fish most of the season. So we're ready to get things up and running first week of May.
Hello, my name's Captain Mark Williams, Silver Diction Charters out of Ludington, Michigan. I've been fishing out of Ludington for over 40 years and just really enjoy fishing up and down the coast of Michigan.
All right, welcome to today's episode of Captain's Roundtable. Today's topic is, what are your go-to knots? What knots are you using? What termination to copper, lead core? If you're using weighted steel, how are you doing your wire? What are the knots to know? So, Win, can you lead us in the way of the knots?
Well, I guess if you line up 100 fishermen, they're going to have 100 different ideas of what knots to use or what on the different techniques that we use out there, the wire divers, the lead cores. I guess I'll start with the wire diver. I'm probably more unique on that than most people are. Most people use terminal tackle on their wire divers. I actually use what they call an Albright knot. It's a saltwater knot tying the wire to 50-pound fluorocarbon. I put just enough fluorocarbon on that I have maybe one crank, one full spool on the reel itself. So it's maybe 12 foot of 50-pound tests. I'm using an Albright knot. You can show that in your techniques on another episode. But the reason why I do that is, number one, I don't have to deal with all the terminal tackle. Number two, when you get a fish into the boat and you got the diver bouncing around on the back deck of the boat, it's subject to kinking when you're just using terminal tackle. And also I feel that 50-pound fluorocarbon that I use works somewhat like a shocker. I do definitely notice on a rough day where obviously your wire divers don't have any give in them at all. The little bit of the mono does work as somewhat of a shocker there, and I think there's times it does help. I've been doing that for 20 years. It's worked for me. There again, everybody will have their own feelings about it. Probably the other one that's a little bit more unique for lead core that I've tried all different ways. But I actually, on my lead cores, I use a small Spro swivel on both sides, on the backing side with the mono, and then on the end where you put the mono on the end of the lead core. There again, most people aren't doing that. It's worked good for me. And it's easy if I got a leader that's kinked or has gotten a break, got screwed up a little bit, I can easily cut it off, tie a new piece on without having to screw around with, taking all the time. So basically, on my 2 cents worth, those are the two things that I do that might be different than most people. So.
All right. Hold on one sec. I got a question that I got to ask you. So if you're running that mono from your wire to your diver, you have a section of mono, do you still run a snubber?
I do on my diver itself. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I still run a snubber.
All right.
I feel that that's an important too. I think there's other people, like somebody sitting next to me here, that does not run a snubber, and I think everybody's got their own. Everybody's got their own way of doing it. But I've always run a snubber on my divers.
So people think that I do this Captain's Roundtable series just so that I can help share information with people on YouTube. However, selfishly,
I'm trying to get the best captains that I can get to come on the show, and then I'm just stealing all of your information. So just keep it coming. No, I'm just kidding. All right, thanks, Win.
Sure.
Kevin, go ahead.
These knots are like Wynn's using. I don't do the one he does, but I just like on my coppers, we use a Spro swivel. Those are very nice, and you got to get the right size to go through your pawl, your reel, because there's different sizes. But we just, on our copper, we just do a simple bimini twist, and they seem to bimini twist on the copper end, and then just your normal knot on your monofilament end. And I have seen the shrink tube thing. I think that's probably another nice feature. But like I say, we use that Spros. The one thing we do a little bit different on our lead core is that I grew up as a child was a fly fisherman, and my father, we didn't have a lot of dough at that time, so my dad, we made our own tapered leaders. And so anybody who fly fishes knows that you start off with a heavy leader and you taper it right down to your end where your fly is. And sometimes back in the day, those tapered leaders were so expensive, especially when you're a young kid snapping them off. We made our own tapered leaders, and you just use that cinch knot. And you take it, wrap it 5 times, 6 times, come back in around through. And that's a knot I learned how to mend 2 lines together as a child. And so I sort of was used to that when I started big lake fishing. And so I use that same knot on my lead core. And what I do is similar to what Wynn said, you take the lead out of the core, and then you hook your 2 lines together, and you do your knot, and you cinch it up good, trim it. But one thing I read about or learned about, I put super glue on it. And so I got just super glue, or knot glue they used to call it, and I just put a bead of that on that termination, and that sort of heals it all together. Mm-hmm. And it's very, it doesn't make a big gob on there or anything, and so it mends those. And I cannot literally say over the years that I've seen us lose a fish because of our knots. The lead is more suspect when people. It used to be with lead core. If you had that lead core riding on your rod tip, it just will break, and you'd think it just wears. But if you're using your lead so that you're always terminating to your board, and that'll be a feature later, so you're not pinching on that lead or using that lead. That's where that's where it seems like you used to get your breaks a lot. It was on the core itself, where we're on the rod tip, or if you were hooking to something. So sure. That's the knot we use. It's pretty simple, and that's what's worked well for me. But the Spros are a nice, particularly for the copper.
What about just mono to terminal tackle?
I just use the what do they call it, improved clinch.
Yep.
4 or 5 times in and around through, and suck it down, wet it a little bit, suck it down, and I don't think I can hardly ever remember losing a fish because of knot. As long as you're, but I think as I'm getting older, Wynn's got
I'm just going to say, I've had a couple come apart, and this is the whole reason I didn't wear my glasses.
or early in the morning.
Yeah.
Sure.
But we, it's very easy to, I fished with Kevin Laxana one time, and we always call it in tournament day, you'd always cut your line back. Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you what, if you're not in a big tournament going through and taking that first 5 to 10 foot off and re-terminating your lines in between sessions, or you're just asking for trouble. And so there's nothing to re-terminate and cut lines, and especially where those fish, especially those big kings with those saber-toothed kings, are mm-hmm. gnawing on your line a little bit. So it's critical to terminate lines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I'm shocked that all of us have different ones.
I know, it's weird. I thought that'd be the same.
So I must be the only one that does the Willis knot for my lead core, which is the removing of the lead, and then doing your overhand knot and threading your mono through it. Even gone to the point of doing 2 overhand knots and threading it through twice. But kind of like they alluded to, as we're getting older with the glasses and such, I was sitting on the back of the boat tying things up just with the improved cinch, and they were coming apart. and I was getting frustrated, and the wife walked out, and she's like, "What are you upset about?" I said, "Like, this line's all rotten." Well, no, it wasn't. I wasn't using my cheaters. So that's something that's important on there. Same thing that Kevin said as far as for the copper, using the sproles on both ends and the rubber sheathing, shrink tube on there. One thing that I do different than Wind is on his wire divers, I don't use the mono directly to the wire. I do the wire directly to the swivel, but I use a cinch knot, just an old hangman's knot, if you want to call it, and use that down with a bead to cover the end of it. So I'm going right to my terminal tackle for my swivel. But like he said, you do get that problem of kinking and things like that, so you got to be cautious on the deck. I like that trick. I'm going to probably steal it from him. So it is a good thing as far as that goes. The other thing is what Kevin was talking about with the lead core. He's spot on with that braking, that sheathing, and I think that's where people get confused at times, because they'll have a 10 color and they'll say, "Oh, well, we're hitting it on a 7," or somebody will hear it's hitting on a 7, so they'll bring it in, only let 7 colors out, and then put the board there and everything, and that's just putting 2 spots in that lead core that's going to break. So you actually have to run the colors.
If you're doing that too, a lot of times that lead core from the board going to your rod will lay in the water and it'll drag that board back. And if you have another board anywhere in that vicinity, that'll cause a lot of boards to jump.
Big mess out there.
So that's just something to consider.
For sure. And then the other thing that's interesting is I run Power Pro on my riggers, and I just use the improved cinch on my terminal for that as well. I know when you use the braid, so you do the same thing. So, you got to get comfortable with your knots. You got to know your knots. I'm fortunate. I've got Jim Carr, kind of a guru with knots and stuff, and I've spent time in the winter trying to learn new knots, but we all fall to what we're confident in and we know it's going to work. So important to know your knots, but use the ones that work for you.
And I think Kevin touched on it a little bit. A lot of times when a knot fails, it's from when you cinch the knot down without lubricating the line. And it actually, the friction will actually put just a little bit of a groove into that mono, and it can lead to a break later on. This is interesting. I really thought that we were all going to say the same things and that this wasn't going to be a very good conversation, but it's because I'm, totally different than even those. I use a uni knot as my knot that I use just about on everything. All of my terminal, I used to use a polymer for a long time. I switched to a uni knot. It's easier for me to tie. I think as I got older, it was easier on my eyes. It's the same motion, so I'm always doing the same thing. I'm not so worried about it. I do use an Albright, not a lot. We do fish lead drops. We don't drop them because that's not a good thing to do anymore. Or it probably never was, but it was more socially acceptable in past decades. But anyways, I do use an Albright knot anytime that I'm tying wire to mono, which is kind of quite a bit. I have a thing on that Albright knot. Willis knot I'm using. All of my terminations are 2S Pros with some kind of shrink, good quality shrink tube too. If you're doing the shrink tube thing, buy something that's a little bit thicker and it'll hold up a lot better. That copper won't, every time that goes through the guides, it's kind of rubbing on that and tearing it up. But if ours gets tore up, we just cut it and redo it. And we have a termination kit right on the boat that has all of the tools you would need, a lighter. That's another thing though. If you are using shrink tube, make sure you shrink it before you tie braid or mono to it. Cause I had a mate that did that and he heated it up and then we hit a fish right away and it broke. And I'm like, did you shrink the tube after you tied the mono to the swivel? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, let's not do that again. But that's something, that's how you learn, unfortunately. And every time you learn in that manner, it's $7, $8.
Was it on a meat rig or a spoon?
No, it's just a spoon.
Okay. You got off cheap.
It makes it easier. Yeah.
I got a question for everybody on these. So when you're running your improved cinch knots, and you alluded to the twists that you were doing, on the heavier weighted, say the 30, 50, 40, or 20, do you change how many twists you're doing? Are you dropping down to say 5 or maybe even 3 on the big ones? Or are you pretty much all the same number of twists?
I would say on 40 or 50 pound tests, I think I've used 5 or 6 twists, but I've always used at least that, just because it's just what I do. If you put a little spit on it and it'll clinch up. Is that the reason that you go to less twists?
I went to less because it was when I was trying to draw them down. I was doing like 6 to 7 of them.
It's hard to get a draw.
It was hard to get a draw even with the lubrication on it and everything. And I was actually talking with Jim Carr and Greg McGee, and they're like, "Yeah, you can do 3 to 5 and you're fine." So, I just was curious what that was.
Like with so I do a lot of steelhead fishing, and I use a uni knot. We used fly rods with shooting line and lots of different techniques to fish. So a lot of times you're tying braid to mono, and we don't use a swivel a lot of times on a rod that you're going to cast because you don't want that swivel to be going through your guides when you're casting. But anyways, I find that with braid I use less twists. Then I don't think it requires as many twists. It grips so much better than mono. So like if I'm tying a uni knot, I might have 6 twists or 6 passes through on the mono side and only have 4 on the braid side, and it seems to be strong. Now, I say that, and then if you do that and break off, it's not my fault.
No, I mean, my cannonballs I only use 6, and that's 300-pound Power Pro. So, I was just curious on that and how folks go.
When I fish Power Pro on downriggers, I've ran boats for Fin Power locks and them before, and some of those boats had braid, and I just used a polymer knot, and I never had any failures. But I know guys that take wire and just tie out overhand knots to a swivel, and that's how they connect their downrigger ball. I can't do it. I mean, I use a termination every time, but I've never seen one fail. So I guess, there's probably tons of different ways to do it, but I think knowing the correct way to tie the knot you're using, and then being very particular when you're doing it and paying attention to a lot of those little details will get you out of trouble. Probably getting some, I don't have the bifocals yet, but I'm heading that direction. I think
coming.
We have them strategically placed around the boat, especially down in the electrical panel. Where you can look at those, the flipping switches.
See, this is how mates. I think this is how young mates can get into the fishing game. Just go right up to you see a captain, say, "Do you need a mate?" Because I can see, I can tie knots. But I will say that having your knowing your knots, that's gotten me jobs working on boats before.
That being on time.
Well, being on time is a critical one too. Yeah.
Well, I think one more thing to look at with going along with the termination stuff, and like you were saying, cutting back for tournaments and different things along those lines. It's important, when we're winding in rods at the end of the day or whatever, almost feeling that line as we're bringing it in, it's running through your fingers, so you can see or feel if there's any breaks or anything, and then we fix it right away. Or if we can't, we're putting a rubber band on that reel. I'm fortunate. I've got a mate that can tie. Bo is just, he's only going to be 16 this year. He's only 15 now. But, he was trained to run that through his fingers because they use a lot of light tackle on their boat official business. And when they're doing it, he's checking. And so we come in, we know that, hey, that thing's got to be cut back or that's got a bad spot.
The one, I always say this, mono's cheap. When you're fishing with baits that cost up to $50, mono's cheap. And if you think something's bad, if you question the line that has any kind of a defect in it, change it. And if you know your knots, you'll change it more because it's easy. You're not struggling to tie the knot. You just tie it. It's second nature to you. So,
especially with the that we're doing so much bottom fishing for lake trout. And with the zebra mussels down there, they're like razors. And it becomes, after 2 to 3 days of working the bottom hard, if you're not changing your leader between the diver and the lure, you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah, and same with downrigger rods for when you're balancing for trout. Check, and you need to check really the whole distance, whatever your lead is. If you got a 20-foot lead to your spin doctor or your Dodger or whatever you're running, you got to check that constantly, because you can go through one patch of zebra mussels and have that compromise your line. So yeah, I think these are, good. I don't know that you're going to get this is the absolute way to do it, because I don't think that there is. I think there's lots of different ways to do it, but knowing your knots, being prepared, having the things that you need to make terminations on the boat, it'll definitely get a rod back